I never wanted to be the kind of man who stood in front of bulldozers or filed restraining orders. After 3 decades working as a government geologist, I had seen enough danger in molten form to last a lifetime. All I wanted was peace. So when I inherited my father's cabin nestled near the base of Mauna Loa, a dormant but very real volcano in our corner of the Pacific, I took it as a sign to live quietly away from sirens and concrete. The slope was green lush and deceptively calm. Tourists took pictures, locals respected its history, and those of us who knew her bones treated her with the reverence one reserves for a sleeping bear. My land sat just outside the jurisdiction of the main residential development, Kalapana Vista Estates. The HOA there had always existed, but until recently it functioned like most did: occasional newsletters, lawn compliance, and overly enthusiastic holiday decorations. They mostly left me alone. I wasn't part of the HOA technically. My property was grandfathered in decades before the association even formed. I was that quiet old guy in the flannel shirt who kept to himself, patched up his fence after storms, and waved at joggers when they passed by. I liked it that way. Then Karen arrived. She came in with designer sunglasses, a clipboard, and the kind of power smile that never reached her eyes. Karen didn't just join the HOA, she commandeered it. Within months, she replaced the longtime board president, restructured the Architectural Review Committee, and secured majority votes for zoning petitions most residents didn't even understand. I heard whispers from my neighbor Tito, who had lived here even longer than I had, that Karen had ties to a mainland development firm with deep pockets and shallow ethics. The whispers became undeniable when surveyor trucks rolled up near the boundary line between my property and the HOA-managed slope. One morning, I walked down to my mailbox and found 3 brightly colored signs hammered into the ground just feet from my fence: future site of Mauna Ridge, luxury villas. I stared at those words for a long time. Luxury villas on the Volcano's southern slope. I knew that terrain like I knew my own scarred hands. That ground wasn't just steep, it was unstable. The lava fields beneath it were porous and fragmented from past eruptions, some as recent as 50 years ago. You'd be crazy to build on it. Worse, you'd be criminally negligent. Later that day, I called the number listed on the sign. A young voice answered clearly, reading from a script. I asked to speak with Karen. I was put on hold. 15 minutes passed. Then the call dropped. The next morning, I took my maps, laminated USGS overlays from my field days, along with soil core records and lava path diagrams, and walked straight to the HOA office. It sat in a building that used to be the community clubhouse, but now looked more like the front desk of a luxury resort: sleek floors, pineapple water dispensers, and framed digital renderings of villas that had no business being built. Karen met me with that same smile. She didn't even invite me to sit. "I know who you are, Mr. Kai," she said, eyes scanning the thick folder in my arms. "I've read your emails." "You haven't replied to them," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "That's because your concerns fall outside HOA jurisdiction. You're not in our association. Your opinions, while passionate, are unsolicited." I opened the folder anyway, laid out the maps, pointed to the lines showing historical lava flows, one of which carved right through the path her planned villas now occupied. "This isn't an opinion," I told her. "This is public geological data. This ridge is a known lava chute. It will flow again. Maybe not this year, maybe not for 10, but when it does, it won't stop for zoning lines or your leaseholders." Karen's eyes narrowed. She didn't even glance down. "The county approved the development. That's all that matters. If you have an issue, take it up with the permitting office." I did. They said they relied on a risk assessment commissioned by, I paused, then held up the document I had requested under public record: Welo Terrain and Partners, which according to their LLC filing is owned by your brother. Her face hardened. I thought I had struck a nerve. But instead of anger, she gave me something worse: amusement. "Mr. Kai," she said, closing my folder and pushing it gently back into my chest. "You've had your quiet little life in your cabin for a long time. But this community is growing. People want beautiful homes, scenic views, and quite frankly, your scare tactics are becoming a nuisance. If I see you interfering with this project again, I will file a complaint for harassment." I left that office with my hands shaking, not from fear but fury. Over the next few weeks, construction trucks arrived like ants swarming a picnic. Trees I had watched grow over decades were chopped down in minutes. I stood behind my property line, helpless, as bulldozers scraped away rock and pushed dirt into trenches that had once held rainwater runoff, the same trenches I knew were designed by nature to redirect lava. I tried filing formal complaints. I sent letters to the county. I called former colleagues at the Geological Survey. Some were sympathetic. Most were exhausted. Unless there's an active eruption warning, one told me their hands are tied. The worst part was how quickly Karen turned the community against me. Newsletters painted me as a fearmonger and obstructionist. I overheard joggers refer to me as the Volcano guy. Someone spray-painted "Move Out Boomer" on my fence in pink. I didn't care about popularity. I cared about the mountain. And something told me she wasn't going to stay asleep much longer. From the moment the first concrete truck rolled up the slope, it was clear this wasn't just another HOA renovation. This was a conquest. Karen didn't just want to build homes, she wanted to build an empire. And that slope, that fragile volcanic ridge I'd spent years studying and preserving, was her canvas. I watched from my porch as fencing crews installed black mesh barriers and "coming soon" signs every 50 feet. Luxury villas, she called them. Elevated living on sacred ground. The phrase was printed across banners that flapped arrogantly in the wind, as if they'd already won. Models showed glass-walled estates with infinity pools jutting toward the volcano's crater, like it was a postcard, not a geological time bomb. Every instinct in me screamed. It wasn't just geological malpractice, it was spiritual violence. This mountain Manuelo wasn't dead. She breathed through her soil. She slept beneath the ash. She carried memory in every fracture of stone. The elders used to say, "Never build where fire once walked." Karen must have missed that memo or bulldozed over it with a smile. I thought the HOA might push back once they saw the extent of her plan. After all, most of them had lived here for years. But they didn't just support her, they worshipped her. Karen had money charisma, and the kind of false certainty people cling to when they're afraid of nuance. She threw HOA mixers with catered hors d'oeuvres, handed out tote bags with her development's logo, and hired a drone photographer to make cinematic videos of the future of Calipana Vista Estates. It was like watching a cult take root. Worse, she began enforcing new HOA rules designed to silence dissent. A new environmental harmony code prohibited any unsightly natural obstruction within HOA view lines. What that meant practically was that trees along property lines, my trees, had to be trimmed to maintain the visibility of her villas under construction. I came home one afternoon to find 2 hired workers cutting into an ohia tree that marked the edge of my father's land. They had already taken down 2 others, and the wood lay in messy piles like broken ribs. "You're trespassing," I said, voice tight. One man shrugged. "We were told this tree's violating HOA code. This is private land, not part of your HOA. Not subject to your rules." The second man pulled out his phone. "Look, I just do what the site manager tells me." I made him call the site manager. It wasn't Karen who answered, it was someone named Derek, her operations guy. He had the slick, arrogant tone of someone who thought GPS coordinates could rewrite property lines. I told him if anyone stepped foot on my land again, without written permission, I'd call the police. He laughed and said, "We'll see who the cops believe when the HOA files for boundary realignment next quarter." Boundary realignment. That night, I barely slept. The forest was quieter than usual, too quiet. Like something in the soil was holding its breath. I pulled out my father's journals and flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for: hand-drawn maps of lava tubes, old photos of the slope before the HOA paved it. My dad had recorded a small vent just south of where Karen's Phase 1 villas were going in. Nothing active, just a collapsed tube, but deep enough to act as a channel if lava ever flowed again. That vent was now a flattened patio site. I sent the documentation to the county engineer's office, the zoning department, and even the local paper. No one responded. I got one automated reply. That was it. Not even a phone call. Meanwhile, Karen held a groundbreaking ceremony with local press and council members smiling behind her like they hadn't seen the warnings. Her speech was televised on local news. She stood on a makeshift stage flanked by renderings of terraced estates and said, "This is more than just development, it's legacy. Calipana Vista is stepping into its future." I sat alone in my cabin, watching her on screen as she placed her hand on the soil like it was hers to command. 2 days later, I received a thick envelope with the HOA seal on the front. Inside was a cease and desist letter accusing me of interfering with approved community development, disseminating false geological claims, and creating a hostile environment for construction personnel. They cited HOA Clause 14C. Any party attempting to undermine the communal vision of Kalapana Vista Estates may be subject to removal of access, legal action, or financial penalty. Again, I reminded myself I wasn't even in the HOA. But that didn't matter to Karen. That week, I lost access to the community center where I swam laps. They claimed plumbing issues. My mailbox was mysteriously removed and replaced with a locked HOA-approved cluster box half a mile away. The community shuttle stopped coming near my street. Neighbors who once waved now looked through me. It was clear what she was doing: isolate, discredit, erase. But I had lived through lava. I had survived real fire. And no HOA president with a blowout hairstyle and a clipboard full of dreams was going to intimidate me into silence. I walked out to the slope one evening just as the sun was dipping behind the mountain and looked at what they were building. Steel frames rose like skeletons against the horizon. Villas carved into earth that had no business being touched. Every line they drew felt like a scar. And deep beneath it all, Mauna remained silent. But silence wasn't safety. It was a warning. I was 12 years old when I first saw lava. It wasn't from Mauna but from her sister Mountain Hilai, a violent, unpredictable force of nature that erupted during a school camping trip. I still remember the silence that came before the flow, the strange static in the air, and then the dull red glow bleeding through the darkness like veins beneath the skin of the earth. That image stayed with me. It followed me through college, through field assignments, through the decades I spent with the U.S. Geological Survey, and it followed me now, an old man standing on his porch, watching fools play with fire they didn't understand. I tried everything I could to get someone to listen. First, I compiled my reports into a presentation, topographic maps, historical flow patterns, thermal imagery, overlays from the last satellite pass. I printed everything and brought it to the next HOA board meeting, even though I wasn't technically a member. I sat in the back corner while Karen gave her usual updates with polished confidence, talking about villa pre-sales, rising property values, and her plans for a Volcano View cafe at the summit overlook. When the floor opened for community questions, I stood up. I have geological documentation, I said clearly. Not opinions, evidence. Your development sits directly on a dormant lava tube connected to Mauna Loa's southern vent system. If it erupts, Karen cut me off with a tight-lipped smile. Thank you, Mr. Kai, but this is a Homeowners Association meeting. As a non-member, your time is limited. Also, let's refrain from alarmism. The county permits are fully in order. I took a deep breath and held up the map. This is from USGS. This isn't about permits. It's about physics. You're ignoring natural lava flow corridors. You've already bulldozed over 3 minor vents. Someone in the audience muttered, "Here we go again." Karen stepped closer to me. You're not a geologist anymore, Mr. Kai. You're a retiree. Please let the professionals do their jobs. That stung more than I thought it would. I had spent my life reading the earth. I knew the way heat fractures rock, the way magma pushes, like a slow fist beneath the crust. I knew the scent of sulfur before a breach. These weren't abstractions. They were real, lethal, and now ignored. After that meeting, I started getting visits. First, it was a young man in khakis who claimed to be from the Community Relations Office. He brought a muffin basket and asked if I'd be willing to cool the rhetoric in exchange for increased dialogue. I showed him to the gate. Then it was a letter from a law firm representing the HOA, threatening defamation if I continued making unsubstantiated public claims that could hinder property sales. They called my warnings reckless speech. I considered going to the press. I drafted emails. I even recorded a video speaking directly into the camera with maps behind me and a list of dates. I tried to upload it to a community forum, but it was flagged and removed within 20 minutes for misinformation. That was when I realized how deep Karen's control really ran. She didn't just control the board, she controlled the narrative. She held the purse strings to community funds, the loyalty of the newer residents who had bought into her vision, and the silence of those who feared their home values might drop if they questioned her. She had created a fragile illusion of paradise, and I was the crack in the glass. I began to notice the isolation more acutely. No more morning waves from Mr. Yamamoto, my 80-year-old neighbor with the koi pond. His grandkids used to visit and pet my goats. Not anymore. The mailman barely made eye contact. The grocery clerk who used to ask about my garden now avoided me like I carried disease. But I wasn't entirely alone. Late one night, a soft knock tapped at my door. It was Anna, one of the younger residents who had recently moved into the HOA community. Her hands trembled as she passed me a manila folder. "I'm not supposed to have this," she whispered. "My husband works in permitting. These are the original geological assessments from the county. They were overridden. Inside were scanned email signatures and a risk assessment that had originally flagged Karen's project as high risk for lava exposure. They changed it," she said. "They pressured the department to accept an independent review instead. That one came from a private firm in California. No local credentials. Wello Terrain and Partners. Again." I thanked her. Told her she was brave. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Please don't tell anyone I gave you that." I promised I wouldn't. The next morning, I mailed copies of the documents, anonymized, to the county council, the local newspaper, and the state geological office. No return address, no name. I didn't expect a miracle. I just needed a spark. That week, Karen sent a crew to pave a new access road right through the eastern side of the slope, flattening brush and blasting into porous lava rock. I watched through binoculars as one of the machines hit something deep and dark. Steam hissed out like a warning. No one stopped. They kept digging. I checked my sensors. The ground temperature had risen 2 degrees over 48 hours. No one else noticed. That night, the mountain moaned. Not loudly, not like in the movies. It was a low, guttural sound like the earth exhaling under strain. I stepped outside, barefoot toes sinking into the cool dirt, and listened. The stars shimmered above, unaware of the sleeping giant below. I felt it in my bones. I knew the signs. But no one wanted to hear. Not until it was too late. The morning the bulldozers tore through my fence, I was standing on my back porch with a cup of bitter coffee and a knot in my stomach. The air smelled wrong, too dry, metallic. Birds that usually chattered through the branches were silent. I could hear the low grumble of diesel engines in the distance. I'd grown used to the sound over the past weeks like a persistent headache. But that morning, it was louder, closer, too close. I followed the sound down the slope, walking the narrow trail I had carved years ago along the lava rock ridge that bordered my land. As I came around the bend near the ridge's crest, I stopped cold. They were on my property. I saw them before they saw me. 3 yellow machines, 2 with scooping arms, 1 with a jackhammer attachment, pushing through what had once been an old-growth cluster of ironwood trees. Trees that lined the natural lava break-line trees that my father had planted after the last eruption to hold the soil. Gone. Already felled. Their trunks shattered, their roots exposed like torn veins. And then I saw the flags. Little red survey flags stabbed into the ground, winding in a neat arc that extended 50 feet into my land. My land. I marched forward, hands clenched, heart-pounding rage and disbelief rising in my throat. A foreman in a hard hat looked up, startled. "This is private property," I shouted. "You're off your permitted zone." He pulled off his ear protection, slowly blinking like I had startled a dog from its nap. "Sir, I was told this boundary was redrawn. HOA approval." I nearly laughed. "HOA can't redraw property lines. This land isn't under your authority. You're trespassing. You're destroying federally registered volcanic buffer zone." He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "I have orders from Ms. Jennings. Said you were notified." "Karen." "Of course." I turned on my heel and stormed back up the hill, boots crunching through broken brush and ash-covered grass. I yanked open the rusted metal cabinet beside my porch where I kept the original property deeds and overlays. My grandfather had them notarized and stored in sealed plastic sleeves untouched for decades. The lines were clear as day. The break line they crossed, that was part of my buffer land set aside by law for geological preservation after the 1967 eruption. I called the county land office, left 3 voicemails. I called the sheriff's office. They told me this was a civil matter. I called the Department of Natural Resources. They referred me to their Volcano Risk Department, which told me they'd escalate the concern. I knew what that meant. More forms, more waiting. But I didn't have time. That night, I took a flashlight and followed the ridge again. I marked every inch of intruded land with reflective tape and placed metal stakes along the perimeter. I took photographs, time-stamped them, uploaded everything into a hard drive, and mailed a copy to a friend of mine at the university. By the next morning, the stakes were gone. So were the flags. The ground where I had walked was freshly bulldozed, the surface flat, and scraped clean like nothing had ever stood there. The message was clear. Karen didn't want to fight. She wanted erasure. I went to her office, not to yell, not to beg, but to see her face when I asked her directly. She was sitting behind her gleaming white desk in a blazer too polished for a woman standing on stolen volcanic ash. "You knew that was my land," I said, voice level. She didn't look up from her laptop. "Your paperwork is outdated. We've submitted a request for boundary realignment through the County Zoning Commission. That land was designated as a lava flow buffer. Your project just wiped out natural protection." She sighed dramatically and finally met my eyes. "Mr. Kai, the world doesn't wait for old men and their sentimental rock piles. This community needs homes, growth, not ghost stories and science fair projects." I leaned in slightly. "You're building on a fault that breathes fire, and you're clinging to superstition." "No," I said quietly. "I'm clinging to science, to memory, to warning." Her voice went cold. "I suggest you lawyer up if you're planning to interfere further." "I'm not interfering. I'm surviving." I turned and walked out. That evening, I found a notice taped to my front gate. It was a formal citation from the HOA, citing non-compliant perimeter structures and unauthorized environmental barriers. They were referring to the stakes I'd placed to mark my land. Again, they had no legal right over me. But Karen was trying to smother me in bureaucracy, hoping I'd fold under the weight of forms and hearings and fees. I spent the following days documenting every move. I installed trail cameras along the ridge. I kept a log of every crew, every intrusion. The ground sensors I'd set near the slope were registering minor microquakes barely noticeable but persistent. I emailed a contact at the Pacific Seismic Center. She agreed to review my data. "These tremors are shallow," she said, "right beneath your slope. It could be tectonic settling, or it could be magma shift. Do you think she'll erupt?" There was a long pause. "If she does, that slope will be the first to go." My breath caught in my throat. "Can you issue a warning? We'd need more evidence, but keep your equipment running." And I did. That night, I walked the border again, this time under a moon that glowed blood orange through drifting ash clouds. I knelt near the scarred tree stumps and placed my hand on the ground. It was warm. Not from the sun, not from the season, from below. The fire was waking, and Karen had no idea she was standing directly on its throat. I woke up to the sound of tires on gravel and the sharp rap of a fist on my door. 3 men stood outside, 2 in suits, one with a camera crew from what looked like a real estate vlog. The one in the center handed me an envelope so thick it might as well have been a brick. His handshake was cold, professional, and uninvited. "Mr. Kai," he said, "you've been formally served." He didn't wait for me to say anything. The crew turned and walked away like they'd just delivered a pizza, leaving dust in their wake and legal dread in my hands. The packet was 35 pages long, printed in heavy legalese, but the message was simple. Karen, backed by the Kalapana Vista Estates HOA, was suing me for defamation, intentional disruption of community operations, and trespassing. It was laughable. I hadn't stepped foot on their land. I hadn't defamed anyone. I had shared public records and scientific warnings, all backed by data and documentation. But Karen didn't need to be right. She just needed to be louder, faster, and better funded. Inside the packet were screenshots of the anonymous tips I'd sent to the county, copies of the emails I'd written to media outlets, and even blurry images from my own trail cameras taken entirely out of context. They claimed I had tampered with construction sites, sabotaged survey equipment, and incited community panic. The fines attached to the accusations were laughably high, and the message between the lines was crystal clear. "Shut up, or we'll bury you in court." I sat down at my father's old desk, the weight of the papers heavy in my lap. My eyes fell on a photograph nailed to the wall, me and my father, both in hard hats, standing at the crater rim of Mauna Loa after the 1987 eruption. We looked like ants beside the fissures, tiny against the churning earth. And yet he had always told me even the smallest voices matter if they speak truth. But truth doesn't pay court fees. I spent the next few days calling every contact I had left in government and academia. Most were sympathetic, but cautious. The ones who still had careers to protect said the same thing. You're in the right, but they've got momentum. Be careful. I even tried getting legal aid. The local environmental law group said my case was complex and might not align with their active priorities. A private attorney quoted me $25,000 just to begin reviewing the HOA's claims. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the ridge again, flashlight in hand, listening to the way the wind moved through the crater like it remembered something I didn't. The mountain didn't speak, but she murmured. She warned. And I understood her the way I understood silence deep in my gut. I knew I was right, but I also knew I was losing. The next day, a new sign appeared at the edge of the slope. Phase 1 grand opening 2 weeks away. Luxury living reimagined. Limited units remaining. They were racing the volcano. And I was the only one standing in the way. Or at least I had been. Now, with the lawsuit pending and no funds for defense, I was being boxed in legally, socially, financially. I tried to speak at the next county council meeting, but the clerk informed me that I was currently involved in litigation, and therefore barred from public comment. Karen's reach extended further than I had feared. I went home and opened the drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was my father's field journal, a rusted compass, and the badge I'd worn during my time with the U.S. Geological Survey. The metal was cool in my palm, dull from age, but sharp with memory. That night, I opened my laptop and began drafting something else. Not a complaint, not another report. A story. I wrote about what was happening, every intrusion, every warning, every silence that followed. I posted it to a geological forum under my real name. I included images, sensor data, before and after construction photos. I tagged former colleagues. I didn't care about the lawsuit anymore. I cared about being heard by anyone who would understand that this wasn't about politics or property values. It was about fire and hubris. A week later, a reply came. It was from Dr. Kiana Apukai, a volcanic hazard specialist I'd trained 2 decades earlier. She was now the director of emergency risk mapping at the Pacific Volcanic Observatory. Uncle Kai, she wrote, I've been following this quietly. I believe you. Let's meet. We sat under a koa tree near the southern ridge the next morning. She brought portable scanning equipment, a fresh set of sensors, and a satellite phone. I pulled the last 2 years of thermal imaging, she said, opening her laptop. There's something moving beneath the slope. Slow, deep, but moving. I stared at the screen. The red hues looked familiar. Too familiar. Is it surface pressure? Not yet, she said. But if the activity continues, it will be. And if it breaches the southern side, it'll follow the historical channel I finished, right through phase 1. She nodded. Karen wouldn't listen to me. But maybe the Earth would make her. Kiana said she'd submit an official advisory to the Office of Emergency Management. It wasn't an eruption warning, not yet. But it would be enough to raise eyebrows. Maybe slow the construction. Maybe buy time. But would it be fast enough? That evening, I received another envelope. This one was thin. Just a single page. A restraining order, filed by Karen Jennings, claiming that I had repeatedly harassed and stalked HOA employees by trespassing with recording equipment and threatening community members with volcanic hysteria. The court date was set for the following Friday. I looked out my window at the ridgeline. The villas were nearly complete. Their steel frames gleamed in the dying light like skeletons preparing for a funeral. Karen hadn't just silenced me. She was about to silence the mountain. 2 days after I received the restraining order, the mountain began to tremble. Not violently, not in the kind of way that shatters windows or sends birds fleeing in clouds. But it was there, subtle, rhythmic, like a giant beneath the soil had begun to stir in its sleep. The kind of tremor that doesn't make headlines, but makes scientists adjust their chairs and squint at their monitors. And it made me sit bolt upright at 3:13 a.m., when my old seismic alert system pinged 3 times in a row. I hadn't heard that sound in over a decade. The display beside my bed glowed orange, with a magnitude of 3.1 shallow and centered less than 2 kilometers beneath the southern slope, right beneath phase 1. I slipped on my boots and stepped outside. The air was unnaturally still. No frogs croaked, no leaves rustled. Even the clouds above the volcano sat like held breath. I walked to the ridgeline and stared down at the skeletal villas silhouetted against the dim light of the moon. Their roofs were being installed now, modern, sleek, designed for aesthetics, not survivability. Karen's masterpiece, her monument. By dawn, I was already on the phone with Dr. Kiana Apukai. It's not just a tremor, I told her. It's directional. The thrust vector is pointed north-northeast, same as 87. She paused, then said, "We've picked up harmonic tremor on our broadband sensors too. It's weak but present. We're monitoring." Harmonic tremor was no joke. It wasn't just a shake, it was movement. Magma movement. "You know what happens next," I said. "Yes," she replied. "We just don't know when." But timing, as always, was everything. Especially because Karen was doubling down. Despite the rumblings, both literal and political, she had scheduled the Phase 1 grand opening gala for the following Saturday. She'd even flown in local news anchors, real estate influencers, and a private chef from Oahu to cater the event. Flyers plastered across the community board read, "Luxury elevated, the future begins at Kalapana Vista." I wondered if the lava would RSVP. Kiana promised to submit a status update to the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. But she warned me not to expect miracles. "The politics are complicated," she admitted. "They don't want to trigger panic unless there's visual evidence or gas release. The pressure's still below the critical threshold." I knew what that meant. It meant Karen had one more week to finish her party. And the mountain had one more week to make her decision. On Wednesday, a geyser of steam burst through a newly dug drainage trench just behind Villa 3B. I heard about it not from the HOA, but from Anna, the same woman who had once slipped me confidential documents. They told the construction crew it was just groundwater hitting residual geothermal rock, she said, her voice shaking on the phone. But it melted the insulation on their equipment. One guy got burned. Did they stop construction? No, she whispered. Karen told them to cover it with gravel and keep going. I clenched my jaw. It wasn't just pride anymore. It was recklessness. It was greed so thick, it drowned out every voice of caution. On Thursday, I checked my trail cams. One caught a heat signature crawling slowly beneath the surface. I forwarded it to Kiana. Her response came minutes later. "It's accelerating. The deformation is shifting. Kai, she's rising." The last time Mauna Welo had risen, 27 homes were buried in molten rock in under 4 hours. But I wasn't sure I had 4 days to stop what was coming. I needed to warn them. Not Karen. She was too far gone, but the residents, the workers, the guests invited to the gala, the children who would run barefoot on stone that might turn to fire under their feet. I posted anonymously to the HOA community forum. Urgent, volcanic risk has increased. Official geological monitors have picked up signs of magma movement. If you live near Phase 1 or are attending the grand opening, please reconsider. Contact emergency services or the Pacific Volcanic Observatory for updates. It was deleted in less than 5 minutes. In its place, a new message appeared from HOA Director Karen Jennings. "Dear residents, please be aware that a former member of the community has been spreading false and dangerous information to instill fear and chaos. Our development site is 100% safe and compliant with all state regulations. Saturday's celebration will go on as planned. Let's celebrate progress, not panic." Celebrate progress. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Then I went into my basement and opened the old steel locker where I kept my father's emergency gear. The same one he'd used when mapping lava tunnels in the 1960s. I took out his gas mask thermal camera and a pair of reinforced boots. If the mountain was going to speak, I was going to be there to listen. And when it did, I wouldn't be silent anymore. Friday night, the eve of the grand opening. The tremors came again, more frequent now and louder. One shook a cup off my kitchen counter. Another cracked a stone on my path in half, like dry bone. I checked my sensor log, 6 quakes in 4 hours, all shallow, all beneath the ridge. But the county issued no warnings, no evacuations, no delays. The villas stood ready, champagne chilled the stage, erected near the overlook facing the crater. I wondered what Karen would wear. I sat alone in my cabin gear-packed laptop, open fingers trembling. I wrote one final message, this time to every news outlet in the region, attaching all my data footage, timestamps, and documents names redacted, nothing sensational. Just facts. The undeniable kind. Subject line, volcanic risk, escalation. Kalapana Vista at critical zone. I didn't sign it with my name. I signed it with coordinates. The exact point where the 1967 flow had broken through. The same point where Karen's stage was now standing. As I hit send, I felt it again, deep and low, like a giant's breath just beneath my floorboards. The rumble had become a voice. and it was calling for silence. Saturday began like any other tropical morning, humid, golden, deceptively perfect. Birds returned to the trees, oblivious, or perhaps simply resigned to the fate that simmered just below their roots. The community buzzed with excitement. Cars rolled through the gates, music thumped lightly from speakers, and HOA banners lined the road in polished rows. Calipana Vista, where dreams rise above. The irony made my stomach twist. I stood at the edge of my land binoculars in hand, watching as people filed into the open-air pavilion Karen had ordered, built just days earlier. There were strings of lights hanging from temporary poles, flower arrangements imported from the mainland, and servers dressed in black and white ferrying trays of canapes. Karen herself stood center stage, speaking into a cordless microphone. Her blonde hair was curled perfectly. Her smile stretched just wide enough for the cameras, and her voice echoed across the hillside as if the mountain cared what she had to say. I couldn't hear the words, didn't need to. I saw the way she gestured to the villas behind her, the rows of identical structures, with their panoramic glass walls gleaming in the sun, and the crowd's polite hollow claps. It was pageantry smoke and mirrors meant to distract from the stone beneath their feet that was beginning once again to wake. At 3:17 p.m., the first tremor hit. This time it wasn't subtle. The champagne bottles on the catering tables rattled. The pavilion lights swung. People paused, looked around, and then laughed nervously. Karen said something to the crowd, made a joke perhaps. Someone raised a glass. I knew better. The sensors in my cabin triggered a warning I hadn't heard since 1987. A shrill repeating tone that meant one thing: vertical uplift. It meant pressure. It meant rising magma. It meant we were out of time. I threw on my gear boots, backpack, camera, and sprinted toward the ridge. My legs ached with each step, lungs burning, but I pushed harder. When I crested the trail and looked down toward the gala, I saw the second tremor hit more violent this time. The ground visibly shuddered. Glass shattered. A speaker crashed to the ground. And then behind them, just beyond the final row of villas, came the glow. Faint at first, then brightening. A deep pulsing red that spread from a hairline crack near the southeast slope and bled upward in a jagged line. Gas hissed from the vent. Smoke poured out like breath from a dragon's throat. And the screaming began. Karen turned mic, still in hand, frozen in place as the crowd erupted into chaos. Tables overturned. People ran in every direction. Some fell. Others pulled out phones, still clinging to disbelief. The human brain is slow to accept the impossible, even when it's flowing right toward you. I scrambled down the ridge toward the nearest access road, waving my arms at the crowd, shouting over the rising roar of steam and flame. This way, follow me, get off the slope. I saw Anna wide-eyed, gripping the hand of a little girl, her niece, maybe running alongside the mass of panicked guests. A father stumbled with a baby stroller. Elderly couples tried to make sense of the smoke caught between confusion and terror. And still the mountain rose. From the new fissure, lava burst through molten, glowing impossibly fast. It surged forward like a river made of blood and hell, swallowing the pristine green landscaping in seconds. One of the model villas, Villa 1A, cracked in half as the flow slammed into its foundation and devoured it whole. Screams turned to sobs, gasps turned to silence. And Karen, she stood motionless on the stage, arms slack at her sides, mascara streaking down her cheeks, the microphone dangling from her hand. Behind her, the lava closed in. I raced to her feet, slipping in the loose gravel heat radiating up through the soles of my boots. Karen, I shouted, "Get off the stage now." She turned slowly, eyes wide, but unfocused. She looked like a woman who had built a glass house and just watched the first stone shatter it. I didn't know, she whispered. "Yes, you did," I said, grabbing her arm. "You just didn't listen." She stumbled as I pulled her down the hill, her designer heels useless in the volcanic debris. Together we ran the air thick with ash and the scent of burning plastic and soil. Lava hissed as it reached the stage, melting the supports buckling the platform into a warped skeleton of wood and steel. We reached the road just as a fire engine from the county rolled up, sirens blaring. Paramedics rushed in with stretchers. Police officers began directing people away from the zone. Drones hovered overhead, capturing the destruction, for news stations already receiving anonymous tips with sensor data and infrared images. My tips. By dusk, the slope was unrecognizable. 6 of the 10 villas were engulfed. 3 more sat on the edge, foundations cracked and smoldering. Only one remained untouched, perched just high enough on a rock shelf to escape the path of destruction. For now. Karen sat on the tailgate of a fire truck wrapped in a foil blanket, staring blankly into the smoke-filled sky. Her phone had melted. Her shoes were gone. Her reputation buried deeper than the concrete slabs now entombed in lava. And yet I felt no satisfaction, only sorrow. Not for her, but for the mountain. For the land. For the elders who warned us, the maps that told us the signs that pulsed beneath our feet, for months ignored and erased and bulldozed. The mountain had spoken, and we had nearly paid for our deafness in blood. That night I returned to my cabin. The tremors had quieted. The mountain, having made her point, was still once more, and I finally was not. By sunrise the villas no longer existed. What stood the day before as steel-framed monuments to Karen's ambition were now nothing more than twisted spines poking from blackened lava. The river of fire had flowed fast and deliberate, following ancient paths carved by centuries of eruptions. Paths we had tried to pretend didn't exist. Nature had reclaimed what was always hers. I stood on the ridge ash, clinging to my boots, binoculars pressed to my face. The devastation was both surreal and absolute. Villa 1A gone. Villa 2B, consumed glass, liquefied roof, collapsed inward like a crushed insect. The gleaming pavers that once lined the central walkway of Calipana Vista Estates, Phase 1, cracked in half and buried beneath 10 feet of solidified magma. There was no mistaking it now. The mountain hadn't just erupted, it had chosen. It had followed the precise route I had mapped out for years. The exact slope I had warned about in meetings and reports, ignored by everyone from the HOA board to county officials. The lava had cut through the development like a scalpel, and it had missed my land entirely. The natural lava buffer my father planted, those ironwood trees they had chopped down. They might have slowed it, maybe even changed the course had they still been there. Instead, the flow had nothing to stop it. Down below, emergency crews had cordoned off the entire site. Yellow tape flapped in the wind. The smell of scorched wood chemicals and sulfur hung thick in the air. Reporters had started arriving, first local, then national. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Karen's prized ribbon-cutting gala was now a FEMA zone. I heard from Anna later that morning. She and her niece were safe, shaken but alive. She said she hadn't heard from Karen since the fire crews had taken her to the hospital for minor burns and observation. She's not talking to anyone, Anna said. Not the board, not the media. She's just quiet. Good, I thought. It was her turn to listen. By mid-afternoon, the lawsuit started. Families who had put deposits on the unbuilt villas were now demanding refunds, compensation, and answers. One couple claimed they were promised geological safety certifications by the HOA's real estate partner. Another claimed they were told the volcano was dormant forever, and that no risk existed on any part of the slope. The legal distinction between dormant and extinct was now a very expensive conversation. But none of them were as furious as the construction company. The lava had swallowed more than villas, it had consumed equipment, machinery, payroll records. They blamed Karen and the HOA for withholding geological data, citing the fraudulent risk assessments I had uncovered weeks earlier. I watched it unfold like an avalanche, each accusation triggering another, each complaint revealing more corruption. It wasn't just bad luck. It was deception. Coordinated, deliberate, well-funded, and now crumbling like the villas they built on sand. I was subpoenaed 2 days later, not as a defendant, as a witness. The state's attorney general was launching an investigation into HOA leadership, zoning manipulation, and fraud. My data testimony and sensor logs were now part of the case. I spent hours with the district prosecutor going over every message I'd sent, every file I'd forwarded, every warning I'd sounded and been ignored for. "You're going to be a star witness," the prosecutor told me. I didn't want to be. I didn't want fame or vindication. I just wanted the mountain to be left alone. 3 days after the eruption, I returned to the slope. The lava had cooled slightly, forming a jagged, brittle crust over the top, but I could still feel the heat radiating from it in waves. Steam hissed from small vents. The air shimmered above the surface. The land was forever changed. I knelt near the edge, pulled out a small rock hammer from my pack, and tapped gently at the hardened edge. I wanted to sample something to remember. Not the destruction, not the pain, but the truth of what happens when we refuse to listen. Behind me, someone approached. I turned, expecting another news crew, maybe a council member. It was Karen. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale, and drawn eyes hollow. She wore a simple windbreaker, no makeup, no entourage. She looked smaller than I remembered. She didn't say anything at first, just stood at the edge of the slope, arms folded tight against her chest, staring down at the ruin of her empire. After a moment, she said, "You warned me." I didn't respond. She kicked a stone near her foot, watching it tumble into a crack in the lava field. I thought I was building something beautiful," she whispered. "I didn't think the ground would betray me." "It didn't," I said quietly. "You betrayed it first." Her shoulders sagged. "They're going to come after me. Investors, homeowners, contractors." I shrugged. "Probably." She looked at me then. "Do you hate me?" "No," I said. She waited like she expected more. I didn't offer it. After a long silence, she asked, "What do I do now?" I nodded toward the ridge. "Leave the mountain alone. That would be a good start." She stayed a moment longer, then turned and walked back down the path alone. And I stayed. Long after the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat there listening to the gentle crackle of cooling rock, the distant murmur of wind pushing through the broken trees. The silence where so much noise had been before. No one was celebrating now. No glasses clinked. No speeches echoed. Only the mountain remained, unforgiving, unmoving, unimpressed. The first official hearing was scheduled exactly 10 days after the eruption. By then, the lava had cooled to a thick, cracked skin forming jagged black waves where streets used to be. The developers' banners had burned to nothing. The glossy brochures featuring renderings of marble bathtubs and infinity pools were now relics of delusion, paper dreams turned to ash. But the real fire had only just begun. It started with a press conference, flanked by officials from the State Geological Office and the County Emergency Management Agency. Dr. Kiana Apukai addressed the public in a firm but somber voice. "We have confirmed that magma activity beneath Mauna Loa had been building for weeks. Independent sensors once outside the official network provided crucial early data that was ignored or suppressed due to conflicting development interests. We are launching a full-scale review of permitting processes and HOA-led zoning influence in Kalapana Vista." I watched her speak from my living room, the volume low, the screen flickering faintly in the late afternoon light. Kiana didn't mention me by name, but she didn't have to. I knew what she was doing. She was protecting me. 2 days later, subpoenas were issued to 5 current and former members of the HOA board, including Karen Jennings. I read the headlines in stunned silence. "Luxury development destroyed by lava flow, HOA faces criminal investigation." Whistleblowers' warnings ignored county under fire for lax oversight. Volcano lawsuit, who knew what and when. I became an unwilling character in a media storm. Reporters left voicemails. Drones hovered outside my cabin. One even tried to interview me while I was tending to my garden. I declined every request. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace, but peace, like the land, had to be earned again. I agreed to one appearance, the formal deposition. Inside a beige conference room, I sat opposite a line of lawyers representing everyone from the Kalapana Vista HOA to the real estate development firm that had helped fund Karen's vision. I wore my best shirt and brought a flash drive loaded with evidence. I stated my name, my background, my credentials. I detailed the warnings, I gave the dates, the refusals, the restraining order. And then I showed them the footage, time-stamped thermal readings, ground uplift maps, even a brief video I had captured on the night before the eruption, red light, glowing faintly behind the silhouette of the ridge, the earth already splitting. There was silence when I finished. The lead attorney, one of those corporate types with gelled hair and a 5-figure watch, asked quietly, "Why did you keep recording if they kept ignoring you?" I looked him in the eye. "Because the mountain doesn't care what you believe. She only cares what you do." He said nothing else. The deposition lasted 3 hours. 3 days later, Karen's attorney filed a motion withdrawing the defamation lawsuit against me. One by one, the charges she had leveled harassment, trespassing, obstruction were dropped. My name was cleared. My property boundaries were recertified and sealed by the county with a formal apology letter and full restitution for the damage caused by the unauthorized construction crews. It should have felt like victory, but it didn't, because the mountain had paid a higher price than any of us. The buffer zone was gone. The ridge, once alive with trees and songbirds, now sat charred and silent. I spent mornings rebuilding fences, not because I feared intruders, but because the land needed lines, again gentle reminders of where respect should begin. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months began stopping by. Some brought food, others simply said, "I'm sorry." A few sat on the porch with me and asked what they could do to help replant the hillside. We started slow. Koa saplings, ironwood, a row of native hibiscus. We laid the roots gently into the earth as if asking permission with each motion. Anna came by every weekend helping with the tools, her niece now laughing in the garden with a dog she'd adopted from a shelter after the eruption. She brought warmth back to the ridge one smile at a time. And Karen, I heard through Anna that she was living in a small rental unit on the other side of the island, her assets frozen, her former board members abandoning her as the lawsuits closed in. Her brother, the one who owned Welo Terrain and Partners, had fled the state entirely. No one was building on Mauna Welo anymore. Not for a long time. The state passed emergency legislation shortly after the disaster, expanding geological protection zones and banning new construction within 2 kilometers of identified lava tubes. They named it the Kai Law. I hadn't asked for that, but it meant something. Not for me, but for the land. It meant she was finally being heard. 1 month after the eruption, I walked the ridge at dawn. The sky was streaked with pink, the crater still venting steam in long, elegant ribbons. I reached the old lava break, now buried under hardened black glass. I placed my hand on the rock, warm, cracked, alive. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Not just for what had happened, but for all the times we thought we could conquer her. The mountain didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was enough. A silence we had finally learned to respect. In the months that followed, the ash settled. The headlines faded. The camera crews moved on. HOA Karen's face stopped appearing in news tickers. Lawsuits were filed closed, some settled, others still lingering in quiet courtrooms far from the mountain's shadow. But here on the ridge, life continued not as it had been, but in a way that felt honest, grounded, real. We had stopped building and started listening. It began with the land itself. Where the lava had cooled and cracked, new shoots of green began to push through. It always amazed me how quickly life returned after fire. The first to emerge were the hardy ferns, unbothered by heat, their fingers curling through glassy black stone like they belonged there. Maybe they did. I built a bench along the ridge trail, just a simple slab of reclaimed wood, with a backrest carved with a phrase my father once told me: "Respect the ground beneath you, or it will remind you why you should have." The community started coming up too. Not all of them, some had moved away, unwilling or unable, to live near the scars of what had happened, but those who stayed came differently, quieter, more thoughtful. Some brought flowers, others came just to sit. Anna brought her niece every weekend. The girl had started painting landscapes, bright, strange ones, filled with fire and trees that bent but didn't break. She gave me one drawn in crayon of the volcano, with a smiling sun overhead. I hung it beside my father's geological maps. One afternoon, a man I didn't recognize approached me near the edge of the flow field. "Mr. Kai," he asked. I was on the HOA board, one of the quieter ones. I studied his face. He looked tired, humbled. "I should have spoken up," he said. "I knew something didn't feel right, but it was easier to follow." I nodded. "It usually is." He glanced at the lava field, then at the saplings we'd planted just beyond it. "You think it'll grow back?" I looked out over the mountain, still venting faint smoke under the setting sun. "She always does," I said. "Just not how we expect." Later that evening, I sat on my porch and reread the final letter from the county. It wasn't anything dramatic, just an official recognition of the land's reclassification as a permanent geological conservation area. No more permits, no more developments, just protection, just silence. Exactly what she'd earned. The wind picked up rustling the leaves. Somewhere below, a family laughed around a fire pit. Music played from a distant house, soft and sincere. The rhythm of life returning slowly. Karen never came back. Last I heard, she had filed for bankruptcy and was facing multiple counts of fraud. But in a strange way, I didn't hate her. I didn't pity her either. She was a symptom, not the disease. We've all been taught in one way or another to conquer the land instead of belong to it. She just believed the myth too deeply. Now maybe we could believe in something else. I began teaching again, not in classrooms, but in open-air gatherings on the slope. Kids came, parents too. We talked about lava tubes, tectonic shifts, the history of the mountain. I showed them how to read the land, not just the science of it, but the soul. Where the heat lingers, where the trees bow, where the silence grows heavy. Where not to build. We called it the Mauna Welo Listening Trail. At the entrance, we placed a stone carved with the names of those who helped restore the land. Not just scientists, but gardeners. Kids with watering cans, retired carpenters, and yes, even a few old HOA members who had come to atone. We didn't charge admission. We didn't pave a parking lot. We let the trail grow wild around the edges. And every time someone finished the loop and came back with dirt on their boots and wonder in their eyes, I felt a little more of the pain lift. The scars remained. But scars aren't the end. They're proof of survival. One night, as I was locking up my tool shed, I looked out toward the horizon. The mountain stood against the fading orange sky, her outline jagged, fierce, and beautiful. Steam rose gently from her side, no longer a threat, just a breath. A whisper. I smiled. "I hear you," I said softly. And I meant it. Because after everything, after the lawsuits and the lava, after the lies and the silence, after the fire that tried to erase us all, what remained was truth. What remained was the mountain. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone.